And welcome on in to the latest edition of the Blue Horseshoe podcast. He is George Bremer. I am Ryan Hickey. And George, we have a loaded Tuesday pod here for you. It's the final podcast. I'm so excited to say this. The final podcast in which we will not know who the Colts will be taking in the draft. So the speculation officially ends today as we record this on Tuesday. The next time we are back together, we will know who the quarterback is. So finally now we can start looking ahead towards the Colts' future and start envisioning it with a specific quarterback instead of just going through all the different scenarios and options. So very excited about that. Speaking of scenarios and options, we will lay out at the end of the podcast every single possibility that could happen between 1, 2, and 3, and how that leaves the Colts at 4, who they should take depending on what quarterbacks are there. So we're going to run through every scenario we think that's conceivable that we could possibly see play out on Thursday night. George has a bone to pick with Chris Ballard and his quarterback philosophy. So we have a lot to get into here, George. But first, before we get into any sort of issues, or I should say any sort of discussions with the Colts and who they're going to take a quarterback, it wouldn't be draft season without some wacky rumor with some bizarre source impacting the draft significantly. And as we're recording this on Tuesday afternoon, Will Levis' stock skyrocketing right now in the NFL draft betting boards, as thanks to a random Reddit user who claims to have inside information that Will Levis is telling his family that the Panthers are taking him with number 1. Levis's odds are through the roof right now to be the number 1 overall pick. So George, I got to ask you this, especially with you being the reporter you are. How much do you trust in this Reddit user, and why? Why is this, the real truth?
My first thought when I saw the odds skyrocket was clearly the Colts are trying to trade up to number 1 to get Will Levis because we've heard how much they love him, and then Carolina will go down to 4 to take CJ Stroud. I mean, that's what makes the most sense here, right? So, no, how much fun would it be though if it's true, and Levis is telling his family this, but he's gotten bad information? And his family's sitting there on Thursday night like, wait a minute, you said you were going to Carolina. What's going on, Will?
Wow. Could you imagine the old okie doke? Frank Reich is too nice. That is the one trait that I think Will can be confident in. Frank Reich, I do not think would lie to his face and say, we're going to take you. And then do the old okie doke. And then it's actually Bryce Young with the first overall pick. You see him like getting ready to stand up, starting like dap up some of his family. That's Will Levis. It's Bryce Young. Oh my God.
I'll say this. If it is true, it's a scoop of the century. So if it is true, this Reddit user deserves, massive amounts of credit. I don't know how much I put into it. The funny thing is this time of year, like you said, I mean, we don't have any gas mask videos yet, but that's probably coming. I mean, it feels like it's going to be one of those years.
Well, I mean, for Will Levis, for his stock to tank, if you will, for going back to the Larry Tunsil gas mask, I mean, all you got to do is just replay the videos of putting mayo in the coffee and eating a banana with the peel on. That should be enough for the Panthers, for the Texans, for the Colts. Say, we're good. We'll pass. We'll go with someone else. It is. I will say we have seen bizarre sources turn out to be true before. Remember when Patrick Mahomes got his massive extension, the person who broke it wasn't Adam Schefter, wasn't Ian Rappaport. It was a liquor store clerk who saw Chiefs GM Brett Veach in there buying champagne and was like, oh, this is, you guys are celebrating. What does this mean? And scooped Adam Schefter and was the first to report that a contract extension between the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes has been agreed upon. So maybe Reddit user, I mean, I don't remember the name, but I know there's a lot of numbers in there. And just like if Reddit and Twitter or anything similar, you can always trust a user that does not have their own picture as the face and has a ton of numbers in their name.
1000%. The funny thing is, I mean, because you don't know, it could be like Will Levis's cousin, and he heard this directly from Will Levis. But odds are it's not. I mean, odds are it's just someone trying to get ahead of the parody accounts and spread whatever they can out there. That's what it normally is. But I'm with you. I mean, this year, the way this draft process has gone, look, it would be surprising, but is there really anything that could happen Thursday that would absolutely just floor you?
Honestly, no. I guess, yes. The only thing that would floor me is if Bryce Young is sitting there at 4 and the Colts take him.
Yeah.
That is the only scenario that I would say, wow, no chance I saw that happening. No chance that would ever even, at this point a wish or a dream just because it feels so concrete that Bryce Young is going number 1 to the Panthers. And if somehow this Reddit user is correct, then I would say he's going number 2 to the Texans. And then that's that. So outside of that scenario, I'm with it. There's so much. And that's part of the reason why later in the pod, we're going to dive into all the scenarios because there's so much that could happen in the first 3 picks that do affect how the Colts do look. But in reality, or in seriousness, I should say, we're talking about Will Levis. Reddit user aside for a second here, even though that has impacted the, Vegas, and we know Vegas is 95% right in a lot of, lines that they make. So for them to move the line based on a Reddit user tip, I think is a mistake. But again, they are way more right than I am. But one
I think
thing,
it's just the money that's coming in. I
true.
think people just saw the Reddit tip and the money's moving the line. So I don't know how much it's Vegas.
You know what? You're probably right about
it's,
that.
It's users.
If you are someone who takes that tip and runs with it, I'm sorry, you're a fool. Now, I could be the fool and you could be cashing your checks on Thursday night and living large and getting a nice steak dinner for free while I'm sitting here, eating peanut butter and jellies. But I'll tell you this, if I'm going to put my hard-earned money down on a bet, it's not going to be a tip from Reddit user 5674 with like a cat emoji as a picture telling me that Will Levis's family knows he's going number 1. That's for sure. But where Vegas is setting the line and right now feeling very confident is not a pick number 1 with Will Levis, pick number 2 with Will Levis, where he is right now the odds-on favorite to be the 2nd overall pick. Now, obviously, George, that's massive for the Colts. Massive. Do you buy that? Look, Vegas is rarely wrong, right? We just talked about all those buildings up there. They're not built on losses. They're built on wins. I don't see where you could, if you were Vegas and you were set in line, where you can actually put Will Levis as the betting favorite to go number 2, because the only team right now legitimately linked, or I should say linked in a popular way, is the Colts with Will Levis. That's the only team right now that has any sort of quote-unquote buzz, whether it's even real or not, is a whole other discussion. But that's the only team with right now buzz around Will Levis. And to me, there's no chance they're trading up to number 2. I don't understand this line. Do you think there's any chance that the Texans actually pull, I guess, a second okie doke after what we thought was going to be Stroud? Then it's, they're not going to take a quarterback. Could they take Will Levis at 2?
I mean, he's also the betting favorite to go at 4. So he's going at 1, 2, and 4, which is going to be a record. I'm pretty sure. I don't think that's happened before in NFL draft history. So that's going to be certainly something interesting to watch. I don't know how that works either. Do like Carolina gets him for a week, and then Houston gets him for a week, and then the Colts do. They just, we'll see how that works out. But in all seriousness, I had heard Levis connected to the Texans before, but it was more at 12. I hadn't really heard him at 2 before. It's not a huge logical leap to say that information would change and they would feel like they can't get him at 12 and then maybe they would take him at 2. I still don't, the name I hear the most, and it's everybody hears it, so it's not like, shocking, is Tyree Wilson. That's what keeps coming up at 2 with the Texans. The big thing to me about 2 and 3 is the potential to trade, because anybody could literally come in there, and then, the assumption is that they're coming up for Stroud, but do we know that? I mean, one thing Chris Ballard said the other day that I think is 100% true is that if you go to these 32 teams and you rank these 4 quarterbacks, you're probably going to get 32 different answers as far as who's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there will be teams coming up that want Richardson. And I'm sure there's teams that aren't talking about it that would come up and want Levis. So I don't know. I don't really buy Levis at 2, but the way this draft process has gone, I'm not going to be stunned by virtually anything that happens. One thing that would shock me is if Bryce Young is on the board and Houston takes somebody else. That would floor me. Anything else? No. I mean, it's been that kind of year.
Oh, it absolutely has. And that's why I expect Will Levis, despite the odds skyrocketing in some books for Will Levis to go number 1 and him being the betting favorite number 2, I fully expect as we're recording this 2 days from now, Will Levis be on the board at 4 for the Colts. Doesn't mean they're going to take him, but I expect him to be an option, and I don't really foresee a team at either 2 or 3 trading up to get Will Levis, just because, again, maybe it's just now this is on purpose, because that's the thing we talked about the George like 2 months ago. That Lion season is here, and everyone wants, everyone has an angle as to why information would be out there. And maybe this is now, maybe, you know what, George, maybe here's what it is. Maybe it's the Texans putting out feelers and leaking out to Reddit users, or maybe it's the Texans themselves, Nick Casario, creating a fake Reddit account, having this fake information out there to really, get the price going, and so he can trade down from 2 and get someone who is desperate to trade up to number 2, who loves Will Levis, who just has to have him and overpays to get him when they could have had him later in the draft. So maybe that's where this is all coming from. But I think when it's all said and done, to kind of flush out the BS, I do think Will Levis, when it's all said and done, will be there at number 4 for the Colts. I think it would be huge if he's not there, to be honest, just because that means he's off the board, and then you are guaranteed sitting there at 4, either Richardson or Stroud. And I think if you're the Colts, even a month ago, if you said you can guarantee one of the 2 being there, I think you absolutely sign for that in a day. In a heartbeat, I should say, not even a day, a heartbeat. So I think I hope Vegas is right. I hope these rumors are right that Levis is now the hot prospect, or now the shiny toy that everyone, as we're so close to the draft, wants to, get a piece of. I just don't, at this point, George, I can't buy it. I fully expect come Thursday night, Levis will be there at 4 for the Colts too, if they want to select him, but at least have an option to.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to guess, that's my thinking right now. He'd still be on the board at 4. I also would say congratulations to his agents. I think they've done a terrific job of leaking stuff out there, and at least making the talk about it. The other thing about this is, and I think we forget this every year, myself included, all of this really probably has no impact on what's actually going to happen. And all this noise, it happens every year, and the teams have pretty much determined there's nobody moving right now on anybody's draft board. It's all talk on the outside. If any of this is true, it's us just finding out stuff the teams have known for a while. But most of it's not. I mean, we see it every year. Last year Malik Willis was going to go in the top 5, and then he's a 3rd round pick. So, and it's one like that every year. I feel like Jacob Eason wasn't a top 5 guy, but he was a 1st round guy, and the Colts ended up getting him in the 4th round. So I feel like every year there's at least one quarterback who's at least talked about as a potential 1st round pick who's on day 3. So, that probably will happen, but pick which one, who knows? It may not be one of these top 4. It may be Hendon Hooker who ends up going, in the 4th or 5th round, depending on how things go. It's just, quarterback is the craziest position every draft. And I think there's so many agendas around it. I think that's what you're seeing. I mean, agents obviously want their guy to go as high as possible. Teams are trying to both push him down, but I think even more than that, like people usually suspect someone like the Colts putting out negative information on CJ Stroud, trying to get him to drop to 4. I think more often it's somebody like the Texans who know they're not going to take him at 2, trying to get the information out there to justify their move. Because if you're trying to say, I'm just using those as an example. I don't think either team have much to do with this. But if you're trying to say this guy's no good and trying to get him to drop to you, you're creating a problem for yourself once you draft him, because then you got a part of the fan base that's saying, hey, wait a minute, why'd you draft him on this, and this? And obviously you come out and say, we don't believe any of this. And if you spread it, you'll be confident in that. But I just think there's more reason for the teams above, the ones that are going to pass to do this, because then they can point at that as why.
I'm glad you brought the CJ Stroud negativity right now, the last week that surfaced, because you're 100% right. Like, this is like, I get why the NFL does it. And the longer you are able to push the draft out, the more it's going to be discussed about. It's not like we're just going to stop talking about the draft, right? We've been talking about it since November. So it's not like, if you push it out till May, that we're just going to stop talking about it. I get why the NFL wants to stretch the schedule, but this is what happens when you have so much time, is that you need something new to talk about. And now it's, CJ Stroud and this S2 test. And it's, all of a sudden now his leadership is getting questioned out of nowhere. And you have now Brady Quinn talking about how he bailed on the Manning Passing Academy without any sort of heads up. And it's just like character assassination. And you're right. It's just one of those things where I think part of it is teams trying to impact the draft stock. I think your Texans point, that's something I've not thought of. I think it's spot on. Because if you're Houston, up until 2 weeks ago, everyone thought, especially your fan base, you were taking a quarterback, either Bryce Young or CJ Stroud. And now if you were truly planning on taking Tyree Wilson, or let's say Will Anderson Jr., you got to justify not taking a quarterback when everyone thinks you're taking a quarterback. And that's obviously the pick that would get the fans excited, even if not good next year. At least you have something to hold on to if you win 3 games. And so if you're not going to do that, if you're just going to run it back with Davis Mills and Case Keenum next year, I think you need a reason to say, hey, look, Stroud's a bad leader. He did not score well on this test that we, really like just kind of knock everything, about him to show you didn't want him. Trust me, guys, we did you a favor not drafting him. You don't want CJ Stroud. Is going to be no good. You'll love Tyree Wilson, but we made the right call and passed on quarterback at 2. I think that's also part of it as well. Some of it's right. Oh, let's try to knock him down so we don't have to trade up and we can get him where we want him. I think also part of it in the case of a team like the Texans that is not going to take a quarterback, it's justifying why aren't you going to take that quarterback? Well, it's because this, and this. And I think a large mix of that right now, but I think a part of it also too is just all this negativity is just so much time. People have got to get new angles, need something to talk about, and let's just, start talking about this in terms of CJ Stroud. It's negativity and it's lack of leadership and it's S2 scores as well. Let me just quickly ask you, because he is now in, consideration for the Colts. Do you take that into consideration? Like, has that, the extra information, we'll call it the last week, has that changed your perception on CJ Stroud and if the Colts should take him at 4?
No, I think, in this whole process, I think the biggest thing, you hear it all the time from the teams, and I think it's 100% true. Tape rules all, and that's, there's very little outside the tape that should really affect you. Somebody does something illegal and there's a criminal record for it, then yeah, that's going to affect it. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of talk. And honestly, if you go back through history, not every time, but a lot of times when these guys fall because of character assassination, whether it's Randy Moss, it's a Warren Sapp, they end up usually being a pretty good pick for whoever gets them, because it's been whatever, was driving it. And I don't know, 90% of the time, I think it's agents, not their agent, somebody else's agent, getting a hold of a scrap of information and calling a reporter they trust and saying, hey, you need to know, this guy puts mayonnaise in his coffee. Of course, that was leaked by Will Levis himself. So maybe that's why he's rising. Maybe people are like, hey, there's nothing you can get on this guy. He put the worst possible thing about him out there on his own. There are no skeletons in the closet. But no, I think that's how, I think teams that put too much stock into this, that's how they get in trouble. That's how you make mistakes. You are looking at the player and you've got to have your own, and most of them do, especially in today's day and age, most of them have their own proprietary information, and that's what they're going on. They really don't care. It could come out that the other 31 teams all have this guy as number 1 in the draft and they think he's undraftable, then they're not going to draft him. I mean, that's how it goes. And so I don't think things like this, but like you said, there's a void. I mean, you've got, what is it? 3 months after the season that we finally get down to the draft, and people have agendas all over the place for whatever reason. And the media has a void to fill. And unfortunately, it happens to somebody every year. I mean, it's CJ Stroud this year. Next year, it'll be somebody else. It's usually quarterback because they're under the biggest microscope. But I will say this, in some ways, it's good for the kids because they're going to face it their whole careers, and you just learn it now. Once you get there, it's going to be the same way. I mean, CJ Stroud gets drafted by some team, and everything he does is going to get reported, where he ate lunch and, where he's shopping for a house, and it doesn't matter. Like if he does anything public, it's news. And, I guess you're getting exposed to that right now.
CJ Stroud goes to St. Elmo's, 2 dozen shrimp down by himself. Sure, the Colts want to take him. It's a lot of shrimp, George. A lot of shrimp to be digesting. That is for sure.
What goes on.
The other thing, too, I'll say is you're right. We in the media are just learning this. And as fans, we're learning about this information, or I'm going to put information in air quotes, because, again, a lot of it, I think some may be true. Others could be fabricated. Others could be just flat out lies. So when this information is out there, the teams already know. Like for the CJ Stroud leadership and S2 score that came out this week or within this last week. Well, Chris Ballard, Shane Steichen, everyone has met with CJ Stroud in person multiple times. If he was a bad leader, the Colts don't need these rumors to come out in order to be like, oh, I guess he is a bad leader. They don't need Brady Quinn telling you that he skipped the Manning Passing Academy the night. Like they know, and they are talking to CJ in person and every other prospect in person. So you can quickly flush out whether he's a good leader or bad leader. I'm going to assume those meetings went well, but if they went poorly, the Colts knew about that months in advance, and didn't need this last week of information to come out to be like, maybe we shouldn't draft CJ Stroud after all because he's not as good as a leader as we thought.
Right.
That's the other thing, too, is these teams, like I said, the board is set. The board is set. Chris Ballard is not going to admit it. He knows who he wants the number one. He knows if there's a guy that's undraftable that's there, he's not going to take him for whatever reason. Teams don't need these rumors that come out now recently to impact their the way they're going to, their draft board is going to shake out and whether they should actually draft a player or not. That is for sure. All right,
if they do, they're in trouble.
Yes.
Let's put it that way.
I forgot. Oh, maybe you can help me out here. I forget who had this quote. I think it's a very famous coach, but he goes, "If you start listening to the fans, you're gonna be sit with them soon." I
don't
can't.
remember what it was, but
I don't
do
remember who said it. But
I do remember that quote coming, and it's absolutely true. And
it's
that goes for the media
100%
too.
true.
I mean, it doesn't matter if outside voices are how you're setting your board, then you're not going to have your job very long.
100%. Could not agree more with that whatsoever. Before we start getting into situations that could arise on Thursday night and what we think the Colts would do if situation A presents itself, you have a bone to pick, George, with Chris Ballard. Let's hear it. Let the listeners know why you do not like his quarterback approach, as we are 2 days away from officially finding out who he will take.
Yeah, I've had a lot of time to think about this because, again, we keep talking about how long the draft process is, and this year's been all about quarterbacks. What about it is not sitting well with me? Why, do I seem like I just don't feel good about the process? And it finally hit me the other day, and I was thinking about it. To me, quarterback's the one position where you shouldn't be aiming for a double or a single. You're swinging for the fences. You either got to hit a home run or strike out, because I feel like and this is where I think some people may think I'm insane. I texted you the other day and said that. I think it's worse to end up with like Kirk Cousins or Daniel Jones or Ryan Tannehill than it is to totally whiff on the pick, because then you end up paying Daniel Jones $40 million a year, and you may be, a playoff team, but few are saying the Giants are a Super Bowl contender. Now, maybe they will end up being, and I mean, at this point, Daniel Jones might be the second best quarterback in the NFC, given how weak things have gone over there.
That's true.
But I just think you get in worse situations when you have that guy who's good enough, but you're always kind of trying to replace. That to me is worse than just whiffing altogether. And I feel like Ballard's trying to hit it down the middle of the fairway here. He's trying to hit that double, be safe, and I just feel like this is the one position you don't do that with.
So to take a peek behind the curtain for the listeners, when George texted me that, I didn't ask him any follow-ups because I did want to be surprised, and I wanted to hear it first from him on the pod and give you a genuine reaction. And I am so glad you said that, George, because it's so funny. I was literally about to bring this point up next before we got to the situations, and it's the exact point I was going to ask you about. So let's say, for example, and we'll get to this situation in a little bit here, but I think you're 100% right, because when you look at, let's say, the two possibilities Colts could have in CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson. Anthony Richardson, I think, is more likely to bust than be a top 3 quarterback in the NFL. But I think with his physical tools, you can see he absolutely has that ability, and his ceiling is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. And in an AFC that just added Aaron Rodgers, now, by the time the Colts are actually playoff contenders, I would bet he's going to be retired. But again, another great quarterback coming over to the AFC conference. I think you're 100% right. I think, to use a baseball term, if you are one of those home run hitters where it's home run or strikeout, I think that's honestly the best case for the Colts right now instead of playing it safe, because you're 100% right. CJ Stroud, we talked to him, we were kind of doing our best case scenarios. The comparison I made, I believe you agree with George, but correct me if I'm wrong if you had another guy in mind, but the guy that has been widely comped to CJ Stroud has been Jared Goff. Now, we've seen Jared Goff get to a Super Bowl, so it's not like it's the worst comp in the world, but Jared Goff does need a ton of help around him. And I think it's fair to say Jared Goff is one of those quarterbacks that needs a team around him to elevate him compared to him elevating the rest of the team. Right? We saw Peyton Manning and Andrew Luck. Those quarterbacks elevated the rest of the team, and that's why the Colts were always in the Super Bowl conversation any single year that those guys were on the field and healthy. And so if you're the Colts with where the roster is right now, I'd rather, I think, take a chance on a guy that could one day elevate the rest of the roster like Anthony Richardson could, even though it's a massive risk compared to CJ Stroud, who I think is a safe play, who I think you're right, could be in that Kirk Cousins, Daniel Jones mode where he can come in right away and be competent. He can be adequate. But will he ever reach in an AFC where you're facing Mahomes and Burrow and Allen and Herbert and Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson gets, his stuff together, Deshaun Watson. And if Russell Wilson has a bounce back, he's still, going to be around for a few years. And Lamar Jackson, if he stays with the Ravens, like we can legitimately rattle off 8 quarterbacks that are at the elite level or like, in the tier below. You have to have a quarterback that is going to be able in any given playoff race beat 2 of those guys, bare minimum, 3 of those guys. And it's just like, right, if you are with someone who's kind of along for the ride more than the one pulling the reins, it's really hard to win. I think it's a tremendous point, George. And one I've been kind of going back and forth on myself with the last week is just like CJ Stroud is a safe pick, 100% right. Maybe he's better than we're giving him credit for. And maybe he can be Justin Herbert, because recall when Justin Herbert was taken 6th overall by the Chargers, there weren't these grand expectations for Justin Herbert. And I think he outplayed so far through 3 years what anyone thought he would. And it's just like you wonder if, unless CJ Stroud reaches that, if you're kind of playing it safe and if you're going to go the more conservative route, is it worth taking, a home run swing with the strikeout possibility absolutely there? Is that better than just, like I said, being a single hitter and hitting 300 every single year?
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at it more from the process than specific players, because I think that's why I think you need to be more aggressive and go up and get the guy that you want, because you put those risks out there and you try to get the best possible guy. I think the problem they've had is, in free agency the last few years, sitting around and waiting for whoever fell into their lap. And then that ends up being more like a single or a double, or last year it was a strikeout anyway. You might as well go and put that risk out there and get the guy that you want the most. And I think that's what bothered me about the process. And it's going to be really interesting because I think, I mentioned when we did best case scenarios, I thought the highest possible ceiling for Stroud is Justin Herbert, but the highest possible ceiling for Richardson is something we've never seen before.
It really is. Like I said, I think it's something the last week I've been kind of going back and forth on. And I think I'm on the Richardson side. Like, if you're right, if we just take players out of it and you say, look, this is a guy who's a physical freak who has, I don't know, a 20% chance of hitting, maybe even, I don't know how you feel about that number, if you think it's higher or lower, but it's definitely more unlikely he is a guy that puts it all together than it's likely that he is a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. But the chance is there. Is that worth the risk? Or like I said, you get a guy that most likely, let's say, could be roughly on any given year the 6th or 7th best quarterback in the AFC. You'll probably get to the playoffs, or at least be in the playoff race every single year for the most part, but can you get over the hump? That's the big question. And I think, George, especially with the way the AFC is right now, I think, honestly, taking a swing at the home run is worth it. You could absolutely blow up and fail in their face, and we could be sitting here 2 years from now, back at the top of the draft, talk about, can Arch Manning be the savior, or could whoever be, help the Colts, kind of lead them back to the promised land. But I do think kind of taking a risk at this point is worth it, just because if it hits, it hits. If not, okay, you kind of back where you are right now. But I think, like I said, if you're the Vikings, if you're a lot of these teams, like they're just kind of in the middle, is it really worth it? And I don't think being in the middle is worth it, George.
I think to me, it's when you have to pay the guy. I think that's where it gets tough. The economics of the position now, you can't just take a Daniel Jones and say, okay, 25 or 30 million, still a lot of money, but we're not, 100% on you. At this point, you basically have to give the guy 40 million plus or walk away. And that's a tough situation to be in if you don't feel like this guy is going to change your franchise. And that's why I think, this position gets harder and harder to deal with every year. I think the economics of it now have pushed you into that. You really have to have a superstar or be starting over with a rookie. Honestly, like that's where you're at now in this league.
That's a good point too. You're right. There's no such thing as like a middle market. Maybe outside of Geno Smith a little bit, but you're right. It's like if you are anywhere decently good, you're still getting top dollar. And Daniel Jones, I think, is a perfect example of that, getting $40 million a year, even though I don't think he's worth it whatsoever. Let me ask you this question before we get into scenarios here. If I guaranteed you right now today that CJ Stroud would be Dak Prescott, would you take that? Would you sign up for that? Or would you say, you know what, I'll take the risk with Richardson? Because Dak Prescott's a guy that is a perennial playoff quarterback, right? The Cowboys are always in the playoffs with him anytime he's healthy. He has won 2 playoff games in his career since 2016. He, for the most part, anytime he played a good opponent, has not looked good in the playoffs whatsoever. But he's a guy that does get you 10, 11 wins every year. And for the most part, is around the Pro Bowl conversation in the NFC. If I told you right now, you take CJ Stroud on Thursday with the number 4 overall pick, his career up to this point would mirror Dak Prescott's in Dallas. Would you take that?
Man, that's a really good question. And a funny thing about that is, Dak came in with Ezekiel Elliott, who was at that time, they were both rookies, one of the top running backs in the NFL. In this case, CJ be coming in with Jonathan Taylor. There'd be some similarities between those Cowboys and these Colts. I think I would, and this is why. Because my other theory is this league's all about getting to the playoffs. The more chances you get, the better the odds you'll finally break through. So, I mean, like, look at where Buffalo is right now. You haven't gotten it done, but you feel like every year they're going to be back in that mix. And maybe it's going back to the Peyton Manning years. Like sooner or later, if you go every year, sooner or later, you're going to get that right mix and you're going to get it done. My problem with the Tannehills and the Cousins and the Daniel Jones is that they don't get you there 3 out of every 5 years. They're more like it's less consistent. And so I think I would take Dak because you have the feeling if he doesn't get hurt or something else doesn't happen with the Cowboys, normally with Dak, they're a playoff team. Your assumption every year going in is they're a playoff team. And if you do that, I think that's your goal in this league. Get there and then see what happens. Every year somebody shocks you and makes a deep run. But I think it's a really good question because at the end of the day, what you want is Patrick Mahomes. I think everyone's going to agree with that, or Joe Burrow. You want that guy that's just going to overcome things, and they're so rare. So, what you're asking is, do you take 100% Dak Prescott or 20% chance it's going to be Patrick Mahomes? And I think it's a really tough question.
It is, and that's why I wanted to ask it. I think maybe even Dak's the better one, just because, like I said, you're in the playoffs every year, unlike Jared Goff, in previous years with the Rams and the Lions. I don't, honestly, George, I wouldn't. At this point, I think I have come to my decision. I don't think Dak Prescott, and like you said, get into the playoffs and then, things can kind of break away eventually. Honestly, I don't buy that, to be honest with you. Like, you look at the Cowboys, I have no faith that they're, even in an NFC that's open, that Dak Prescott could play at a high level for 3 games to get them into the Super Bowl. And it's like, you look in the AFC, like, just because, like, if you get in the mix all the time, I don't think, like, I just don't, at least right now, I can't foresee a situation that, like, if you, let's say, you're in the playoffs 5 years, eventually one of those years, kind of, you'll get the right path, if you will. And part of, even if you do get the right path, you still have to win the game and you still have to have your quarterback play well. And Dak, outside of beating the 8-9 Buccaneers last year, has not played well in the playoffs whatsoever. And so you could keep on getting there, but if you have a quarterback similar to Kirk Cousins that could play well in the regular season and then consistently struggles in the playoffs, I just don't think it's worth it, just because I don't think right now, especially where the AFC is, you can afford to have a quarterback not play well and still get there. Like, you look at the last 5 years of guys that have gotten to the Super Bowl, it's been Mahomes, Brady, Burrow. That's it. That's it. So it's just like one of those things where it's like you have to still be an elite quarterback to get through the gauntlet that is an AFC. You're not going to, you don't have guys like Kenny Pickett or Tua just kind of trickling on through, take it down to Mahomes or take it down to Burrow in the playoffs. Like, it doesn't happen. So I think at this point, like, 100% of Dak Prescott, where you're a playoff team every single year, or 20% of Mahomes, I think I'm taking the swing of Mahomes. Because I don't think right now in the AFC, if you don't have Mahomes, you have a chance. I really don't believe that's the case.
There's a lot to that. I mean, San Francisco's the only team we've seen, and that's on the other side, consistently make runs without a star quarterback. Everybody else in the league, the last time I can remember happening in the AFC was the Jaguars, who really should have gone to the Super Bowl in 2017.
Yeah.
They blew that game in New England with Blake Bortles. But other than that, like you said, it's even just getting to the AFC Championship. Man, Titans made one run there, and then the Chiefs kind of jumped all over them. But most of the time, that AFC Championship game has been, well, all the time lately, Mahomes versus Brady or Mahomes versus Burrow. Like, there's been nobody else, get to see the table, even for the right to go to the Super Bowl. So, and I think the guy, knocking on that door is Josh Allen. So it's a really, really hard thing. And I think it's interesting to see, because I don't know that there's been an AFC team like Dallas yet, though. The quarterbacks in this league have had pretty good teams around them, and he does too. I don't know. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that works out, because you would think right now Dallas would have gotten there last couple of years. The NFC's kind of weak, kind of down. And you see Jalen Hurts step up in Philadelphia, take control of that conference. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really hard question, and I don't think there is a right answer. I just think, for me, I would take the chance at going to playoff every year. But I can see the other side of it. I really can. I just think it's so hard to get that guy. And that's what makes this so tough. It's so hard to get that top guy, but at the same time, I think that leads to you taking that swing when it's there.
And that's part of the reason why I think Richardson, just even heading to this process, is viewed as a top 5 pick, despite the fact that the tape and the consistency is nowhere near screaming top 5 pick. But it's just one of those things where, if you're Chris Ballard, and you have taken to consideration where you are. Now, you are in the easiest division in the AFC, so that helps. But right now, the only team that is, I would say, formidable and looks like they're going to be a force every year is the Jaguars. But other than that, like the Titans right now are declining. Texans are the Texans, and the Colts are the Colts. So right now, you have 3 teams stumbling over each other, and the Jaguars right now are the class of the AFC South. But that's the only division where there's not 2 guaranteed playoff teams in it that you feel confident about in the AFC. But again, I just don't, if you're the Colts right now, I just don't think you can see making the playoffs every year as a win, just because with how tough the conference is. I don't think constantly showing up as a 6 seed or even a 4 seed if you win the division, and then having to win 3 games is like one of those, eventually, if you keep knocking on the door, eventually it's going to, break down. I think right now, if you're Buffalo, you got to feel like you've been knocking on the door a ton recently. No one's answering, and I don't think right now there's you should feel like, this is going to be our year just because we've been here so many times. With the Cowboys too in the NFC, which is more open, which they should have a better chance of getting there. They've been there outside of 2020 every single year. I don't feel confident whatsoever that, they are any closer now than they were even in Dak's rookie year in 2016, because he's not played well. They don't, to me, have the right pieces. So I don't think it's a luck thing, if you will. Not that you're saying that is.
No,
it's one of those things where I would just definitely take the chance of having a blow up in my face, having to scrap Richardson in 2 or 3 years, and having it fail, but having the slight chance that it works. And if it works, it's going to work incredibly where you are. I think you can confidently say we could go head to head with the Chiefs and we can go head to head with the Bengals. But right now, if CJ Stroud pans out to be Dak Prescott, unless you truly build a San Francisco roster, which we've seen the Colts try to do, George, and have failed to do, because it's insanely hard. It's insanely hard to have basically a Pro Bowl player at every position, or at least every positional group. And the 49ers have done that at an insanely elite level. John Lynch and Shanahan deserve a ton of credit for how they built that roster. But there's a reason why you mentioned it. They're the only team that has kind of gone down that path, because it's very, very hard to do. So if you have Dak Prescott in that 49ers offense, I would think differently. But because that is, even a bigger crapshoot and I think a tougher task than just having Anthony Richardson pan out, I think you're going to have to really rely on your quarterback to be able to go head to head with Mahomes and Burrow and Allen and Lawrence and probably Herbert, bare minimum, Lamar, to have, to feel good about having a chance in the playoffs, and that's why I think I would take the big swing. But it's something Chris Ballard better be considering, because it's tough, it's unfair being in the AFC, and again, adding Aaron Rodgers doesn't make anything any easier for sure. But
for a year or two.
those are the cards. That's true, for a year or two at least. Which is the good news for the Colts, is that I would be shocked. We have a playoff game in a few years here. Colts, Jets, Aaron Rodgers taking on Stroud, Richardson, Levis, Hendon Hooker. Let's just get nuts.
Yeah, there's no chance with Hendon Hooker. I mean, that Hendon Hooker is going to rule the AFC here in 2 years. So no one wants a piece of Hendon Hooker.
Oh boy, that is, unfortunately, it doesn't look like the Colts want a piece of Hendon Hooker either, George. That's the biggest shame. Speaking of which, let's wrap up the podcast with this. There's a lot of crap that could happen at picks 1, 2, and 3. So let's talk about what could happen and what the Colts should do if they're in this situation. Now, let's put a caveat out here first, George. Despite the Reddit rumors, do you feel, and this is up to you for this exercise, do you feel comfortable saying Bryce Young to the Panthers is a lock and let's focus on picks 2 and 3? What could happen? Or do you say let's open it up and still you have maybe doubts that Frank Reich will take Bryce Young at number 1?
I mean, Aaron Wilson was pretty emphatic last week when we talked to him on the pod. If you haven't heard that one, you want to go back and listen. It's the CJ Stroud pod. He was very emphatic that Bryce Young is going to Carolina. He is an excellent reporter, very well sourced. I'm going to go with him over Reddit in this case.
Okay, so we will say Bryce Young to the Panthers. Sorry, Reddit users. Sorry, people that have taken this Reddit tip and run to Vegas with it, but just change the odds. Does not look like you'll be cashing your checks anytime soon. So, okay.
Hey, I'm always wrong though, so maybe they should. Maybe more people should follow this ticket now. But
and to double down on that, I agree with you. And when we were both in agreement, that is when the opposite happened. So Will Levis, number 1 to the Panthers, lock it up.
exactly.
But for this, exercise, we will say Bryce Young to the Panthers, number 1, it's a lock. So let's look at them. What can happen at picks 2 and 3 and what the Colts should do. Scenario number 1. I'll try to do a deep voice here to kind of make it a little more dramatic. The Texans draft a defensive player. The Cardinals draft a defensive player. I don't know if that was even audible, so we're going to drop that. Also, my voice kind of hurts because I can't do deep voice. That is for sure. I was not gifted with the...
It sounded a little bit like the school announcements, though. I kind of like that. Like, the people come in the morning, the principals on the PA. It was good.
Okay, maybe got a future in leading school districts one day. We'll see. Probably not. So, defensive player at 2. Let's just say Tyree Wilson. Will Anderson Jr. at pick number 3. Texans, Cardinals do not trade out, which means the Colts at number 4, George, have their pick of the litter. Stroud, Levis, Richardson. What do you think? How should we do this? Should we do what
Are we doing what they should do or what they will do? I think there's 2 different things.
No, absolutely. I agree. Let's do both. Should and will. Let's start with should. You're Chris Ballard. You have those 3 quarterbacks. What should you do?
I think in that situation, you should go with, it's hard. And I think that's where this all comes down to. It's the conversation we just had, and so I'll stick with my answer there and say CJ Stroud. But I don't think it's a slam dunk. And I think that's why you don't trade up to 3, because you sit here now and you say they're all 3 there and you're debating which one to take, then why would you go up for one of them? But I would say Stroud, because I think the largest reason here is the one thing you hear consistently, no matter who's connected to them, the one thing you hear consistently is they want somebody who's ready to go right away, who can step in day one, be the starter. And I think of those 3, Stroud probably fits that the best. Plus, as I've been saying since the combine, I think the description of the quarterback that they keep putting out there, to me, best fits CJ Stroud. So stick with, what you say you're looking for. Stick with the guy who's going to be the day 1 starter. And in this situation, take CJ Stroud.
If I was Chris Ballard, I would take a swing what we talked about before. I would take the 20% chance it works, 20% chance you get an elite top 5, top 3 quarterback. I'll go Anthony Richardson at pick number 4. Now, let's get into the mind of Chris Ballard, which right now is a steel trap because we've heard nothing whatsoever. No
Nothing.
hints, no rumors, no idea of what the hell he is thinking. What do you think Chris Ballard will do if you have Stroud, Levis, and Richardson on the board at his disposal?
I'm leaning a lot on how much they've talked about accuracy. When you hear them talk, whether it's Ballard, whether it's Steichen, whether it's Jim Bob Cooter, every one of them this offseason, the first thing out of their mouth has been accuracy. If that's accurate, if that's what they're really looking for, it's got to be CJ Stroud.
I agree. I think what Chris Ballard would do in that situation, I think he would take CJ Stroud. I'm with you right there. Like I said, you brought up a great point about trying to play right away. CJ Stroud, I think, is definitely the most pro ready of those three guys. I think that they would roll out with Stroud 100%. Okay. So that is one quarterback taken in the top three. That is Bryce Young. Let's go with two quarterbacks taken the top three. So let's say the Texans at pick number 2 stay there, take Tyree Wilson. Cardinals trade out. And let's say CJ Stroud is the quarterback that is taken at number 3 by whatever team you want to list. Colts then have a choice, Richardson, Levis. What will they do? What should they do?
Now's where I'm with you, because I think the ceiling on Levis for me is good, but not great. And I just don't know. Like I said before, I think there's a chance CJ Stroud becomes Justin Herbert, and I'll take that chance. In this situation, I don't know to me where Levis' ceiling is. It's good. I think it's better than a lot of people are saying, but it's definitely not going to touch. No one's is going to touch Anthony Richardson's. And I think in this situation, I am all in on Anthony Richardson.
I'm with you. Should and will, for you and for me, it's the same answer. If it's Levis or Richardson, I'm taking Richardson every day of the week, twice on Sunday, and going there. So okay, so the
Twice
Texans
on Thursday.
twice on Thursday too. You're right. Well, especially because that's probably gonna be the only primetime game the Colts get this year. So you got to look extra good on a Thursday compared to a Sunday. That's for sure. Okay. So let's keep that scenario the same, just change the quarterbacks. Texans stay at 2, they take a defensive player. Cardinals, again, they trade out. This time you have Anthony Richardson taken. So you have now pick 4, Levis or Stroud.
This is not a tough one for me either. I'm going to go with Stroud. I just think the ceiling again is higher. I do think Levis is more pro ready than maybe people are giving him credit for, just because Kentucky did a lot of NFL style things. The way they called plays, some of the concepts that they used. I think he's more ready probably to step in and play than necessarily is always discussed. But I just, again, its ceiling for me has a lot to do with it. The only reason I put Stroud over Richardson is I think there's a better chance that Stroud hits where his ceiling is. In this case, I think I'm going with the higher ceiling because I think they're about equal on whether or not they'll get where they should. Because I really think Levis has a good chance of being the best version of himself in the NFL. I'm just not sure where that puts him. I keep hearing Ryan Tannehill's name thrown around a lot there, and that's not exciting to me at number 4 overall.
I'm with you. The comp I made when we were kind of talking about best case scenario was Mitch Trubisky, kind of a guy that could lead to the playoffs once in a while, but leaves you wanting more. So that's why I would take Stroud, should and will. And to me, that's the easiest, debate, or that's the easiest situation and say, what would you do if Richardson is taken at 3 and you're sitting there with Stroud or Levis on the board? I'm going CJ Stroud. I'm not even letting the clock tick down 10 seconds. As soon as that timer starts ticking, I'm writing Stroud. I'm running up to the commissioner. Raj, I won't even let him get off the stage. He turns around, starts walking back. Boom. Roger, here you go. Right back. Turn around. CJ Stroud. All right.
I will say this. The Colts were at a lot of Kentucky games this fall, for whatever that's worth. They saw a lot of Will Levis.
Now,
whether that's, what that's indicative of, I don't know. But they saw a lot of Will Levis.
Is that good or bad for Will? This is a
It's
rough
a good question.
year.
It's a good question. What's really interesting is everybody and anyone who's listening to this is plugged in and knows, what's going on out there. You're all aware of the Will Levis buzz and the fact that, everywhere is Will Levis to the Colts, except for Reddit, where he's going number 1 to pick Carolina. But it felt like Friday, it felt like Chris Ballard was trying to tamp that down. Now, again, is he doing that, to hide their intentions? But when he talked to us with the media, he said there's a perception that we're all in on one guy. That's not true. And then when he talked to the in-house podcast that they do, the official Colts podcast, he said that he felt like they were doing a good job of keeping their information in house. And from what's out there, no one knows what they're going to do. So both of those, to me, I interpret as they're not as sold on Will Levis as, but there's other information that I've had that says they kind of are. So I don't know. It's one of the many things that just confuses you about this process this year.
And Chris Ballard has said he's not a liar. He tells the truth or he's dancing around topics. So the ones he doesn't want to answer, he'll just try to sidestep as well. So I think it is fair to take him at his word. And if he's true about the guy the Colts like the most is not out there, then you know what that means, George? Jake Haener, pick 35. Let's go. See you later. We're all this speculation is all for naught. That is for sure.
Go Bulldogs.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Finally, let's finish this. The last scenario in terms of where there's two quarterbacks taking the top three. Obviously, Bryce Young is there, number one. Let's say the Texans stay there, take a defensive player. And let's say the Cardinals trade out and Will Levis is the quarterback that is taken. The buzz is real, George. Some team says, I need Will more than anyone else, and they go get Will Levis. And now if you're Chris Ballard, you're sitting there with CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson at your disposal. What are you doing?
Again, I'll go Stroud because I think there's a better chance he hits the ceiling. I think Richardson has I know Richardson has the higher ceiling, but I think there's a better chance that Stroud gets there. And I personally think Stroud's ceiling's higher than is being depicted. I think there's more there. I think Ohio State's offense, in some ways, I think it's a double-edged sword. In some ways, it helped him a ton because he had receivers that are probably better than wherever he lands in the NFL, to be honest. But in other ways, it can be a bit paint by number. And I think it limited him in some ways. And I think when he gets into an NFL offense and he's given more freedom, because like Will Levis came to line with multiple plays and did some of those things that you do at the NFL level, I think when that happens with Stroud, you may see him go even a little bit higher than people expect.
The reason why I would go Richardson here is I think it's a little, not a little, it's a lot. It's a lot of trust in Shane Steichen. Now, it's blind trust, right? Because we've seen him do it at other teams, but we haven't seen him do it here in Indy. So it's banking on the fact that how he's developed guys like Jalen Hurts will continue here with a guy like Anthony Richardson. And it's also dependent on Richardson being as motivated and dedicated to getting better as we've seen Jalen Hurts do. And especially if you hear him after his press conference when he got that big contract on Monday, he's basically talking about the money's not changing anything, and he's basically excited to get back to work. That's a guy that's is committed to winning no matter what. That's a guy, and we've heard Shane Steichen talk about it relentlessly. That's what he looks for in a quarterback. And if Richardson has that obsessive gene, which I think would partly lead them to drafting him, I would trust Shane Steichen to put him in a position and develop him to the point where you would feel good about the chances of him hitting. Now, again, I think it's still under 50%. I still think it's more likely than not that he busts out. But it's kind of a leap of faith, if I was Chris Ballard, of saying, it was a long vetting process. We got you because of your ability to develop quarterbacks. This is a guy that's extremely raw, but I trust you to get the most out of him. I would take a swing on that and kind of, take a real trust fall in Shane Steichen's ability to develop a quarterback than the more ready-made guy in CJ Stroud. And the other thing that's frustrating, George, and I know we talk about this a lot, but as we sit here, I still don't know what CJ Stroud you're getting. Is it the CJ Stroud we saw in the Georgia game? Or is it the CJ Stroud that we saw for 95% of his career at Ohio State, where, for the most part, he has played really well against inferior opponents and has struggled against teams of his level or better than him? And so it's just frustrating just because if you were getting the Georgia CJ Stroud, then I would agree 100%. His ceiling is higher than we're giving him credit for. And we saw him go toe-to-toe with the best team and the best defense in the country and almost pull it off. Yes, that's a guy that you feel then all of a sudden could take advantage of a lot of defenses in the NFL. The issue is it was one game. And so you're going to get that? I can't feel right now that we're going to get that guy without a doubt. So if there's questions about, what kind of guy you're getting, I'll then just take the risk and I'll take the flyer on a guy whose upside is way higher. Bust rate is a lot higher too, but upside is a lot higher, and hope it pans out.
And I think it's a completely fair argument. And I think it's something that is definitely being discussed in that room. I think for me, that's the 20% chance I'm willing to take, though, is that shot that you're going to get the Georgia version of CJ Stroud because we've seen it. I think that's the edge for me. I'm very much of that old scouting adage. If they've done it once, they can do it. We've seen it. So I'm more willing to bet on Shane Steichen getting that from CJ Stroud on a consistent basis because we know it's in there. But I think it's an equal, it's an even argument. I don't remember if I told this story or not about Jalen Hurts. I think I might have said it before on the pod. The year that he was in the combine, they moved the combine a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, to the convention center. It used to be all done in Lucas Oil Stadium. In the convention center, the media room is way on the other side of the building from where we go to do the interviews. So I'm walking to the interview room. I'm taking a different route than I usually take, and it's the day before the quarterback's throw. And Jalen Hurts is out there with his trainer and whoever else is out there with him, throwing in the hallway of the convention center. That's how committed this guy is. And I remember watching that and thinking, because I'd heard the stories, people had talked about it, coming out of Alabama and Oklahoma. And I thought, wow, this kid really is who they say he is in terms of, and, Richardson's saying a lot of the right things. And that's why I wanted to bring that up. You were talking about, is he going to be willing to put that work in? He had the quote the other day that he's going to be a Hall of Famer because he's going to grind to do that. If he is truly going to be in that mentality, and you pair that with a coach like Shane Steichen, yeah, the ceiling could be unbelievable here. But I feel like Levis and Stroud are hard workers too. And I guess the bottom line here is what we're saying is the only way Will Levis ends up as a Colt is if 3 quarterbacks go before and he's the only guy sitting there for.
That brings us, George, to the last case or the last possible scenario since we've talked about just Bryce Young going number 1 and then 2 and 3 defensive players and the Colts having their pick of the litter. We've talked about if 2 quarterbacks go in the top 3 in each scenario where if Levis is taking what happens, if Stroud's taking what happens, if Richardson's taking what happens between the other 2. Now let's talk about the final scenario that could happen here. And that is 3 quarterbacks go in the first 3 picks. So Bryce Young at number 1, let's say CJ Stroud at number 2, and let's say Anthony Richardson at pick number 3. Colts are sitting there at 4. Will Levis is the only quarterback on the board. Do you think they should take him? Do you think they will take him? Oh, sorry. Jeez. I just fired up, knocking the mic down.
I think they will. Because I honestly believe that they feel like the 3 guys they're most likely to get are worth the number 4 pick. I think that's why Chris Ballard's so comfortable. And I don't think he's shooting down interest in Will Levis in general. I think he's shooting down the idea that any of these guys is head and shoulders above any of the others. And we just made the argument for Stroud and Richardson on why you should feel good either way. I think the argument on Levis is that leadership component that he brings in. I think he's the guy that's going to walk in from day one. And he won't be the leader of this team from day one because that's not how it works, but he'll carry himself that way and he'll start winning over the teammates from day one that way. And I think that's what they're going to look at. I think that's why they're going to take him. You know what I'm going to say on what they should do. What they should do in that situation is take Will Anderson because he's still on the board and then trade back in with, I don't know, Dallas supposedly wants out of their spot. Detroit supposedly wants out of their spot. Trade back into the first round and take Super Bowl MVP Hendon Hooker.
Here's my only well, I guess actually, never mind. In this scenario, well, if the Texans trade out, I am concerned that they would take Hendon Hooker. Aaron Wilson, last week when he was on with us, what quarterback did he mention, George? They did a lot of homework on. Hendon Hooker.
MVP Hendon Hooker.
So that's my only fear in terms of if you pass on Levis at 4 and you are dead set on getting a quarterback, which, look, we know Jim Irsay is excited to get a quarterback. So in terms of they will draft Will Levis without a doubt at number 4 because Irsay, I think at this point is we're not leaving pick number 4 without a quarterback. In terms of honestly, I would probably say should too. Should take Will Levis just because I'm with you with Hendon Hooker. I like Hendon Hooker. I honestly just though at this point don't trust that he'll be there even at what is that Cowboys pick? Let's say 25. I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but it's in the mid 20s. I don't think he's going to go that far. Maybe this is just again we talked about Malik Willis rising up last year, and then he's sitting there in the 3rd round, and it wasn't even the second quarterback taken off the board eventually. So maybe this is just overinflation. I am buying the Texans liking Hendon Hooker. So I just at 12 when you have that second pick, especially if you're the Texans. And they trade out, or even get, they take a defensive player at 2. I think that 12 is going to be in real play for Hendon Hooker. And
So
I
we
just
have played out every scenario, which means Hooker's going 4, right?
Hooker
Because
is
that's the
going
one thing we
4.
didn't talk about. So that's take that one to the bank.
Oh,
Reddit.
and well, also too, who is it? Badgett at the Senior Bowl. I forget what school he's at. Like William Mary or something like that. Very small school. Was at the Senior
Shepard,
Bowl.
I think. I want to say.
Thank you. So maybe that's the guy now. Literally, no one is talking about Chris Ballard's going to shock the world and take him.
I tell you what, he did look good at the combine. Not number 4 good. But
How
his
about
ball
35?
pretty
How about pick
impressive.
35?
No.
That's a guy I think you feel confident saying he will be there. Pick 35.
Yeah, and beyond.
Yeah.
I think he's a day 3 guy, but he's my pick. While we're at it, he's my pick to be the Brock Purdy of this draft. He's my pick.
Okay.
Someone takes on day 3. Now, there's not going to be another Brock Purdy. I have to preface it with that. No one's coming in and winning 5 games in a row and taking his team to the playoffs. And, that unless he ends up on the 49ers, there's not going to be another Brock Purdy.
Which, you know what? Would you put it past him, George?
I absolutely would not
take another quarterback.
Down there, why not? I mean, when you're talking about where we're talking about him going, why not? But I do think he could be that day 3 guy that at least is getting buzz, from camp and from preseason, and people feel really good about where he's at. We'll see. He could be a Tony Romo type.
The last thing I'll ask you then, because maybe the Colts will be in the Tony Romo, Brock Purdy sweepstakes, if this does happen, if they trade out of 4. Is there any scenario, we just kind of lined up the different ways that, the quarterbacks could fall within the first 3 picks and how that could adjust the Colts board and what they do. Is there any scenario where they are sitting there at 4 and either trade out or just trade out?
They'd have to not like the guy. That's why I don't think it happens, because I really think from everything they've said that they feel confident with all 3 of these guys. And like we said before, I think there's one trait in particular with all of them: Stroud's accuracy, Richardson's ceiling, Levis's leadership, that gives them confidence. If I'm wrong about that, and it's possible, that's when they would trade out. If the one guy standing, if the quarterbacks go 1, 2, 3, and the one guy standing is just not worth it for them at number 4. Now, the question is, will they have a partner? I would say yes, because I would think someone in that situation would come up for Will Anderson.
I think the best case scenario, well, not best case. I'm sorry, this is the worst case scenario. I apologize, the phrasing there, but I was going to say the best, if you wanted to make an argument, I don't think the Colts will trade down. I think there's no chance of it happening. If you wanted to make the argument of a trade down, I think the only way that happens is in the first scenario we laid out. If Bryce Young goes number 1, the Texans stay at 2, defensive player. Cardinals stay at 3, defensive player. And a team like the Raiders calls you. Now, it's still a risk because I could see the Lions taking a quarterback. I could see the Seahawks taking a quarterback as well. So if a team like the Raiders wants to jump up from 7 to 4 and they love, I don't know, CJ Stroud more than anyone else, and they said, we're going to pay a premium to get CJ Stroud on our team. The one thing you've heard Chris Ballard say is he doesn't see a separation in the quarterbacks. If that's the case, now again, it's still a risk because you could still be sitting there at 7 and have no quarterback to choose from. But if you have 3 on the board at 4 and you truly don't see a difference or don't see a major gap in between the 3 where you feel comfortable with any of the 3 being on your team, and the Raiders are going to give you a first-round pick in 2024, I think it's the only way we could see Chris Ballard even contemplate trading down. But I still think it's too big of a risk where then you're all of a sudden now hoping the Seahawks and Lions don't take a quarterback or trade out of that pick and someone else jumps them to get a quarterback. I think it's just too risky. And again, I think Chris Ballard, Jim Irsay has made it clear. He wants a quarterback. He wants a quarterback at pick 4. We've seen a medal before. I don't think he would allow Chris Ballard to sit there at 4, fielding phone calls of 3 quarterbacks are on the board and trading down.
I hadn't thought about that scenario, but that probably is the one that makes the most sense. And it would be interesting if the Raiders are calling them and saying, we'll give you a 2024 first rounder. And their head coach lost to Jeff Saturday last year. It's going to have to be a really interesting conversation. But I agree with you. I think you're going to sit back and say it's too much risk, because the Seahawks could take a quarterback at 5. The Lions could take a quarterback at 6 and they're all off the board, or they could trade out. One of them could trade out. The other one could take a guy. I would probably not take that risk. I still think the only way it does happen, I don't think it does, but I think the only way it does happen is if the guy left is just not, they just don't feel like that guy's worth number 4 and they can't pull that trigger and they feel like they have to take Will Anderson. We'll see how it plays out. I think there are people that would argue, Bryce Young's the only one that you take over Will Anderson. I think there's people that will argue it's only Young and Stroud. That's what makes this draft so fascinating. I think the opinions on these quarterbacks are as widespread as I can remember. Last year it was that way too, but no one thought very many of them, if any of them, were worth the first round, and the league obviously agreed with only Pickett going in the first round. Now you're talking about possibly 3 or 4 of them in the top 10 and no real consensus on how they should line up. To me, Thursday is going to be fascinating.
And here's the final reason, George, why the Colts absolutely should not trade out. They pick a number 4. I don't care who they pick. This is a guarantee to steal it from Charles Barkley. I love the way he says it. Guarantee. Whoever the Colts take at number 4 will be a Hall of Famer. You want to know why, George? The last 3 times the Colts have picked inside the top 4, it has been Andrew Luck on a Hall of Fame trajectory till his offensive line let him down, and Ryan Grigson, Voldemort.
May he rest in peace.
Edgerrin James, Peyton Manning. Last time the Colts have picked anywhere inside the top 4, it has been those 3 players last 3 times. So I don't care what they take, George. Will Levis, start sizing him up for that nice gold Canton jacket. Hall of Fame.
And when they had the number 3 pick and they traded down, they got Quentin Nelson, who's on a Canton trajectory as well. So, we'll see. I'm not going to bring up Jeff George's name because I wouldn't do that.
No, that's going to ruin the bit, George. Come on. Positive
that was
vibes
30
only here.
years ago. That's ancient history.
Positive vibes only. PVO.
And as Mike Chappell points out, they did trade like his best wide receiver and one of his best linemen to get him. So that probably has something to do with the failure there as well. So
that's true.
Yeah, now my camera's like tapping out here too. So
I think your camera's ready for the pick. That's for sure. I think your camera also agrees. See, they went up and down like a head nod of yes, Hall of Fame. Doesn't matter who the quarterback is. Will Levis, Richardson. Let's go. Lock it up. The Colts and
you're saying Hall of Fame. It's
Hendon Hooker. Top 4 picks have done the Colts well the last 3 times. Hopefully, fingers crossed, George. It's a 4-4-4 when we're talking about 20 years from now. But
you will see.
Before we get to Ken and 20 years from now, we do have to get to Thursday and get the number 4 overall pick. Just to reiterate, in case you missed our last podcast, George and I are in agreement. We are both predicting the Colts at number 4 will stay there and take Anthony Richardson, quarterback, Florida. Our predictions have been terrible, especially when we agree. They are always wrong. So take that to the bank. But we at least both predict come Thursday, you will hear Anthony Richardson's name called at pick number 4 for Indy. But let me tell you, George, I'm just excited that it's finally over. Like, I do love speculation. I do love talking about what ifs and hypotheticals. It is fun. But when we talk about it for 3 months, 4 months, it does get a little tiresome.
And we can finally start, like you said, I think at the top of this podcast, we can finally start talking about what it looks like with a specific quarterback.
Right.
Okay, what should expectations be? What more do they need to do? How did they fill out the rest of the draft around him? And how does that change our opinion of this roster? I mean, those are going to be fun conversations to have as well. And hey, the great thing about this year is rookie minicamp is the next week. So Thursday, we're going to find out who this quarterback is. And next Friday and Saturday, we're going to get a look at him on the field with the rookies, but it'll be fun.
Oh, it will be fun. No doubt about it. All right. So that'll do for this edition of the Blue Horseshoe podcast. We will be back on Thursday evening. We'll give you some more details on what we're planning to do for the draft here shortly, but it's going to be a busy next few days. That is for sure. So enjoy the draft. Fingers crossed the Colts get a winner here. We'll talk to you Thursday night right here on the Blue Horseshoe podcast.